There are seasons in life when heaven seems quiet, you've prayed, and the walls don't echo, you've cried, but no answer comes, you've worshipped, and yet it feels like the heavens are brass. Somebody in here knows what it is to call on God, and all you can hear is the sound of your own voice bouncing back at you. But let me tell you, silence is not absence, and delay is not denial. Just because you don't hear him doesn't mean he isn't speaking. Just because you can't trace his hand doesn't mean you can't trust his heart. Today, we're going to talk about what to do when God feels silent, because even in the silence, God is still working. There are moments in life when it feels like everything has gone quiet. You pray and nothing happens. You fast and still there's no movement. You worship and the heavens seem locked up. And if we're not careful, we will confuse God's silence with God's absence. We will confuse a pause with a period. But I came to tell you, silence is not the end of the story. Silence is not a shutdown. Silence is a setup for God to show you something about himself that you would never see if he answered you too quickly. A setup for him to stretch your faith, to deepen your patience, and to prepare you for a blessing that is bigger than the prayer you prayed. Think about it. If God answered every request the moment you asked, you would never grow. If he gave you everything you wanted as soon as you wanted it, you would never learn to trust him in the dark. Sometimes he holds back his voice so you will learn to trust his character. Sometimes he withholds his answer so you will lean into the promise he already gave you. Silence is the workshop of trust. Silence is the classroom of faith. Silence is where God does his best preparation in you, because when he gets ready to speak, he's not just going to give you an answer. He's going to give you a revelation. Look at the story of Lazarus. Mary and Martha cried out, "Lord, the one you love is sick." But Jesus waited. He didn't move when they called. He didn't show up when they expected. He stayed silent for days. To them, it looked like a shutdown. It looked like rejection, but in reality, it was a setup. Because when Jesus finally showed up, he didn't just heal a sick man, he raised a dead man, and the miracle was greater than the request. The silence was setting the stage for the glory. What looked like neglect was really divine strategy. And you've been in that place. You've been asking God to come through, and it seems like he's not even listening. You've been watching the clock, but heaven is silent. Don't misinterpret the silence. God is not ignoring you. He's orchestrating something. He's aligning things behind the scenes. He's working on people you can't see. He's shifting circumstances you don't even know about. He's getting everything in position so that when he speaks, when he moves, when he shows up, it will blow your mind. You see, silence doesn't mean shut down. It means he's setting the table. He's getting the stage ready. He's positioning the players. He's preparing the blessing. And when it looks like nothing is happening, God is doing his best work. The seed doesn't make any noise in the soil, but it's growing. The baby in the womb doesn't shout while it's forming, but it's developing. The silence is proof that something is coming together. And when the silence breaks, you'll realize that the delay was not wasted time. It was preparation time. That's why you can't give up in the silence. You can't throw in the towel just because you don't hear anything. You can't let your emotions trick you into believing God has left you. This is the setup. The quiet is the setup. The waiting is the setup. The stillness is the setup. He's setting you up to see his power, to know his faithfulness, and to experience his glory in a way you never have before. When God is silent, it's easy to start questioning yourself, questioning your prayers, questioning your walk with him. But silence is not a sign that his power has weakened. It's not evidence that he has lost control or that his throne has been shaken. God does not go silent because he is powerless. He goes silent because he wants to see what your faith will do in the waiting. The silence isn't about his ability. It's about your trust. It's about whether you can hold on to what he said even when you don't hear him saying anything new. Every test you face in life has a purpose, and the silence of God is one of the greatest tests of faith you will ever encounter. Because when the answer doesn't come, when the healing doesn't show up, when the breakthrough takes longer than you expected, that's when the roots of your faith are exposed. Anybody can shout when God is speaking, but can you still believe when he's quiet? Anybody can dance when God is answering, but can you still worship when it looks like heaven has turned its back? Silence is the proving ground of real faith. Silence strips away the surface-level religion and reveals the depth of your trust. Think about Abraham. God promised him a son, but for years heaven was silent. No update, no confirmation, no timetable. And in the silence, Abraham had to decide whether he would believe the promise or give up on it. And though he struggled, though he staggered, he held on to what God had said. His faith was tested in the silence, not when the baby was born. The baby was the manifestation, but the faith was proven in the waiting. That's why the Bible says Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. The silence was not a shutdown of God's power, it was the testing ground of Abraham's trust. And Job, sitting in the ashes, scraping his wounds, surrounded by friends who accused him and a wife who told him to curse God and die, found himself in the silence of heaven. He cried out, and no answer came. He wept, and no comfort came. But even in that silence, Job said, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust him." His faith was tested not in the moments when God blessed him with wealth and health and family, but in the silence when everything was stripped away. And in that silence, Job's faith spoke louder than his circumstances. That's what the silence does. It separates those who follow God for the blessings from those who follow him because he is God. It separates those who are looking for a performance from those who are standing on a promise. Because when you're in the silence, the question is not, can God still do it? The question is, do you still believe he can? His power has not changed, his hand has not weakened, his authority has not diminished. But your faith is being refined, your faith is being tested, your faith is being stretched, and sometimes the silence lasts longer than you thought it would. You thought the answer would come in a week, but it's been a year. You thought the breakthrough would come overnight, but it's been a decade. But even then, the silence does not mean he has failed. It means he is watching to see if your faith will outlast your frustration. It means he is proving whether your trust is anchored in results or anchored in his character. The silence tests your faith, not his power, because his power never changes. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. There will come times when heaven feels like it has gone quiet, when you pray and no answer comes, when you seek and nothing opens, when you cry out and all you hear is the echo of your own voice. In those moments, your survival depends on what you do with what God has already spoken. Because when you cannot hear a fresh word, you must learn to stand on the word he already gave you. When you don't feel his presence, you must lean on his promise. When you can't trace his hand, you must trust his heart. God does not have to repeat himself to prove himself. What he said once, he meant forever. So many times we wait for God to say something new when the strength we need is already hidden in what he has said before. If he told you he would never leave you nor forsake you, that word is enough to hold you in the silence. If he told you that all things work together for good to them that love him, that word is enough to carry you through the confusion. If he told you no weapon formed against you shall prosper, that word is enough to withstand the attacks. When the heavens are silent, you must turn your ear back to the written word, the eternal word, the word that never fails. Think about Israel in the wilderness. God gave them a promise that they were going to a land flowing with milk and honey. Yet in the journey there were long stretches where they did not hear his voice, where they faced hunger, thirst, and danger. What kept them moving was not a new word every day, but the promise that had already been spoken. The silence was not an indication of abandonment. It was an invitation to hold on to the word that was already released. Think about Jesus in the wilderness. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, the enemy came to tempt him. And when the voice of the Father was silent, Jesus leaned on what had already been spoken in the Word. He said, "It is written." He didn't need a new voice from heaven because he already had a word in his spirit. That's why the enemy couldn't break him. That's why the silence didn't destroy him. He had an anchor in what was already said. That's the challenge for many of us. We want God to keep giving us fresh signs, fresh confirmations, fresh affirmations, because we don't want to rely on what he's already spoken. But faith is not built on constant reassurance. It is built on confidence in the character of God. If he said it, he will do it. If he spoke it, he will bring it to pass. The silence does not erase the promise. The silence magnifies the promise, because when you don't hear him, you have to go back to the last thing he told you and walk in it until he speaks again. And sometimes that's the hardest thing to do, walking in obedience without fresh instructions, trusting in the dark what he told you in the light, standing firm on a word that your circumstances seem to contradict. But that's where faith comes alive. That's where spiritual maturity takes root. Because if God has already spoken, he does not need to prove himself twice. One word from God is enough to carry you through a lifetime of silence. One promise from God is strong enough to hold you steady when everything else is shaking. One declaration from his mouth is eternal, unshakable, unchanging, and it will outlast the silence every time. Nobody likes silence. We want answers fast, breakthroughs quick, blessings on demand, but spiritual maturity is not birthed in the moments when everything is happening the way you expect. Spiritual maturity is developed in the silence. Silence is the soil where your roots go deeper, where your character is formed, where your faith is strengthened beyond feelings. Because if you only trust God when you can hear him, you are still a child in the Spirit. But when you learn to trust him in the silence, you are growing into maturity. Silence forces you to grow past your emotions and step into real faith. A child cries every time they can't see their parent, but an adult knows that love remains even when sight is gone. In the same way, spiritual immaturity demands constant signs and wonders, but maturity rests in the assurance of who God is, even when no signs are present. The silence is training you to stop depending on goosebumps, to stop depending on feelings, to stop depending on visible confirmation. It's teaching you to stand on truth instead of evidence, to rest in promise instead of performance. Look at Joseph, thrown in a pit, sold into slavery, falsely accused, locked in a prison, and for years heaven was silent. No angel appeared, no voice broke through the night, no sign of rescue came, but in the silence Joseph grew, in the silence his integrity was tested, in the silence his character was refined. And by the time he stepped into the palace, he was no longer the arrogant boy who flaunted his dream. He was a mature man who could handle the weight of leadership and the burden of responsibility. The silence was not punishment, it was preparation. It was the soil where maturity grew. The same is true for David, anointed as king but sent back to the field to tend sheep, chosen by God but chased by Saul, hiding in caves, running for his life. There were long stretches when it looked like God had forgotten his promise. But it was in those silent years that David learned how to pray, how to worship, how to fight battles in private before he fought giants in public. The silence prepared him for the throne. The silence was where he matured into the man who could lead a nation. And sometimes that's exactly what God is doing in your life. You think the silence means he's ignoring you, but in reality, he's maturing you. He's teaching you how to be steady when you don't feel him. He's teaching you how to hold your peace when you don't hear his voice. He's teaching you how to endure hardship without losing faith. The silence is shaping you into someone who doesn't just praise him for what he does, but worships him for who he is. Maturity doesn't happen overnight. Seeds don't sprout the same day they're planted. Trees don't bear fruit the same year they take root. Growth requires time in the dark, time in the quiet, time in the soil. And the soil doesn't make noise. The soil looks empty. The soil feels hidden. But the silence of the soil is where the roots are stretching deeper, where the foundation is becoming stronger, where life is being prepared to break through. You don't see it, but you're growing. You don't hear it, but you're maturing. You don't feel it, but something is happening inside you that is preparing you for what God has spoken. When God goes silent, it does not mean he has nothing to say. Sometimes silence is his loudest sermon. Sometimes silence is his greatest message, because silence forces you to lean in closer, to press in deeper, to listen not with your ears but with your spirit. God is not always trying to shout over the noise of your life. Sometimes he waits until you quiet yourself enough to realize that even his silence is speaking. Silence says, "Trust me." Silence says, "Wait on me." Silence says, "I am still God, even when you don't hear me." The problem is, most of us don't like silence. We live in a world of constant noise. Phones buzzing, televisions blaring, people talking, notifications popping up. And when heaven seems silent, we panic, because we think silence means abandonment. But if you lean in deeper, you will realize that silence is often the way God draws you closer. It is in the silence that you learn how to pray more earnestly, how to worship more sincerely, how to seek him not for what he gives, but for who he is. Silence calls you out of shallow faith into deeper waters. Elijah learned this lesson on the mountain. He was desperate to hear from God, and the wind came, but God wasn't in the wind. The earthquake came, but God wasn't in the earthquake. The fire came, but God wasn't in the fire. And after all the noise had passed, there was a still small voice. That whisper carried more power than the shaking of the earth, because it required Elijah to lean in, to tune his ear, to go deeper in his pursuit. God spoke loudest in what looked like silence, because the whisper forced Elijah to quiet himself and lean in. That's what silence does. It teaches you to lean. When you don't hear anything, you lean on what he has said. When you don't feel anything, you lean on who he has been. When you don't see anything, you lean on the faithfulness of his character, and the more you lean in, the louder the silence becomes. The more you press in, the more you realize God is not absent. He's pulling you closer. Think about a teacher in a classroom. The teacher is most silent during the test, not because they are gone, not because they don't care, but because they've already given you the instruction you need. The silence is a chance for you to remember, to lean on what has been taught, to apply what you've already learned. God is the same way. In the silence, he is speaking louder than words. He is saying, "I trust you with this test. I've equipped you for this trial. I've prepared you for this season." And if you lean in, you'll recognize his silence is not empty. It's full of meaning. Silence is also where intimacy grows. In relationships, the people you are closest to are the ones you can sit with in silence and still feel secure. You don't need constant words when trust is deep. And God wants you to grow into that kind of intimacy with him, that you don't need him to speak every second for you to know he is there, that even when he is silent, his presence is felt, his love is steady, his promise is sure. So the next time heaven seems quiet, don't run, don't panic, don't give up. Lean in deeper. Turn down the volume of the world, quiet the noise of your own fears, and listen. Because God speaks loudest through silence when you are willing to lean closer, when you are willing to press harder, when you are willing to seek him beyond the surface. His silence is not rejection, it is invitation. It is his way of pulling you from the shallow into the deep, from the surface into the secret place, from religion into relationship.